some wounds never show on the surface. They hide beneath perfectly pressed uniforms, behind bright smiles at office parties, and under the careful makeup applied each morning. Sarah Martinez learned this truth the hard way when a colleague's thoughtless comment about her convenient PT excuse shattered the carefully built walls she had constructed around her most painful secret. What started as workplace mockery would soon become a moment of revelation that changed not just how her coworkers saw her, but how an entire community understood the invisible battles that veterans fight long after they return home. Sometimes the deepest scars are the ones no one can see, and sometimes it takes extraordinary courage to show them to the world. This is the true story of a woman who carried her war wounds in silence. Until the day silence was no longer an option, Sarah Martinez arrived at Hartwell Financial Services every morning at exactly 7:30, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun, her navy blazer pressed to perfection. She carried herself with a confidence that made people assume she had never faced a day of real hardship in her 32 years of life. Her colleagues saw a successful account manager who closed deals with military precision and never missed a deadline. What they didn't see were the nights she spent staring at the ceiling, fighting battles that had ended 3 years ago on a dusty road in Afghanistan. The office buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy as Sarah settled into her cubicle, checking emails and reviewing client portfolios. Around her, coworkers discussed weekend plans and shared stories about family barbecues. Sarah listened with practiced interest, occasionally offering appropriate comments, but never sharing much about her own life. She had perfected the art of being friendly without being personal, professional without being vulnerable. "Morning, Martinez," called out Derek Hoffman, sliding his chair over from the neighboring cubicle. Derek was the type of guy who wore expensive suits but somehow always looked disheveled, and who thought his MBA from a state school made him an expert on everything. "Ready for another week of crushing the competition?" Sarah offered a polite smile. "Always ready, Derek." Derek had been trying to get Sarah to join his social circle since she started working at the company 18 months ago. He hosted regular happy hours at trendy downtown bars and organized weekend golf outings that seemed more about networking than recreation. Sarah had politely declined every invitation, citing various commitments that were vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. "You know, you really should come out with us sometime," Derek continued, leaning against her desk. "All work and no play, right? I mean, what do you even do for fun? Hit the gym and do push-ups all night." The comment stung more than Derek could have known. Sarah's relationship with physical fitness had become complicated since her return from deployment. What had once been a source of strength and pride had become a painful reminder of limitations she wasn't ready to acknowledge, even to herself. "I managed to keep busy," Sarah replied, turning her attention back to her computer screen. Derek didn't take the hint. "Come on, you're like a mystery woman around here. Nobody knows anything about you except that you used to be in the army or something. Were you one of those tough drill sergeant types? I bet you could beat up half the guys in this office." Sarah's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She had learned to navigate these conversations carefully, sharing just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything that mattered. "I was in logistics," she said simply. Nothing too exciting. This was her standard response, and it usually worked. People heard logistics, and their eyes glazed over, imagining endless paperwork and supply inventories. They didn't picture convoy routes through hostile territory or the split-second decisions that meant the difference between coming home and never seeing your family again. Sarah preferred it that way. The truth was that Sergeant Sarah Martinez had been awarded a Bronze Star for her actions during an improvised explosive device attack that had torn apart her convoy and left 3 soldiers dead. She had pulled 2 wounded comrades to safety while under enemy fire and had helped coordinate the medical evacuation that saved their lives. The military had called her a hero, but Sarah had never felt like one. She felt like a fraud who had survived when better people hadn't. Derek finally wandered off to bother someone else, and Sarah tried to focus on her work. She had a presentation to prepare for the Jenkins account, a small manufacturing company that was considering switching their pension plan management to Hartwell. It was exactly the type of detail-oriented work that helped keep her mind occupied and her demons at bay. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah's phone buzzed with a reminder for her 11:30 appointment. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she blocked out an hour and a half on her calendar for PT, physical therapy. To her coworkers, this suggested a minor sports injury or maybe chronic back pain from too much time at a desk. They had no idea that her physical therapy sessions were part of an ongoing treatment program for traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Sarah had been caught in the blast radius of the IED explosion that had changed everything. While her physical wounds had healed relatively quickly, the invisible damage had proven more persistent. The headaches, the difficulty concentrating, the sudden panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds. These were the symptoms that required ongoing treatment, even though they couldn't be seen from the outside. As 11 o'clock approached, Sarah began gathering her things for her appointment. She had developed a routine of finishing urgent tasks before leaving, ensuring that her absence wouldn't create any obvious problems for her team. She prided herself on never letting her personal issues affect her professional responsibilities. Heading out for your mysterious PT session again. Derek's voice came from behind her as she reached for her purse. Sarah turned around to find Derek watching her with that same curious expression he always wore when trying to figure out what made her tick. Just some maintenance work, she said lightly. Nothing dramatic. Must be some serious maintenance if you need it 3 times a week, Derek persisted. What did you do? Tear your ACL running marathons? Something like that, Sarah replied, hoping the conversation would end there. But Derek was feeling particularly chatty that morning. You know, I've been wondering about this PT thing for a while now. It just seems like a pretty convenient excuse to duck out of the office whenever you want. I mean, who actually needs that much physical therapy unless they're rehabbing from major surgery? Sarah felt her chest tighten, that familiar sensation that preceded the onset of panic. She had worked hard to control these episodes, learning breathing techniques and grounding exercises that helped her maintain composure in difficult situations. It's a legitimate medical appointment, Derek, she said quietly. Oh, I'm sure it is, Derek said with a knowing smirk. Legitimate medical appointment, just like those mysterious sick days you take sometimes. Look, I get it. We all need mental health breaks. But some of us are honest about it instead of hiding behind medical excuses. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She could feel her face flushing and her hands beginning to shake slightly. The rational part of her mind knew that Derek was just being his usual insensitive self, that he had no idea what he was really talking about. But the wounded part of her mind, the part that still carried the weight of that day in Afghanistan, heard his words as an accusation of weakness and deception. I need to go, Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. She could feel several other co-workers watching the exchange with interest, and she was desperate to get out of the office before she completely lost her composure. Derek seemed to sense that he had struck a nerve, and his expression shifted from casual mockery to something that might have been concern. Hey, I didn't mean anything personal. I just think it's funny how some people get to bend the rules while the rest of us have to. I said I need to go, Sarah interrupted, grabbing her jacket and heading for the exit. She could feel eyes following her as she walked quickly toward the elevator, and she heard Derek's voice behind her, saying something to the other cubicle workers about how some people couldn't take a joke. Sarah focused on keeping her breathing steady as she waited for the elevator doors to open, fighting the urge to run back and tell Derek exactly what her PT excuse really meant. The elevator ride down to the parking garage felt like it took forever. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the polished metal doors, and she could see the stress lines around her eyes that no amount of concealer could completely hide. She looked tired, she realized. Not just the kind of tired that came from a busy work week, but the deep, bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying secrets that grew heavier every day. By the time Sarah reached her car, she had managed to regain some measure of control over her emotions. She sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, practicing the breathing exercises her therapist had taught her. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. Repeat until the tightness in her chest began to ease. Her physical therapy clinic was located in a medical complex about 15 minutes from her office, in a building that housed a variety of specialists who treated everything from sports injuries to chronic pain conditions. Sarah had chosen this particular clinic partly because of their expertise in treating veterans, but also because it was far enough from her workplace that she was unlikely to run into anyone she knew. Dr. Patricia Chun had been Sarah's physical therapist for the past year and a half, and had become something of a lifeline during Sarah's most difficult moments. Dr. Chun was a former Army medic who understood the unique challenges faced by veterans transitioning back to civilian life, and she had a gift for addressing both the physical and emotional aspects of recovery. You look tense today, Dr. Chun observed as Sarah entered the treatment room. Rough morning. Sarah found herself explaining the encounter with Derek, feeling embarrassed by how much his comments had affected her. Dr. Chen listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "It sounds like he touched on some feelings you've been carrying around," Dr. Chen said when Sarah had finished her story. "How long have you been worried that people might see your treatment as an excuse or a sign of weakness?" The question forced Sarah to confront something she had been avoiding for months. The truth was that she lived in constant fear of being exposed as somehow fraudulent or damaged. She worked harder than anyone else in her office, took on extra responsibilities, and never complained about anything because she was terrified that people would discover she wasn't as strong as she appeared to be. "Since the beginning," Sarah admitted, "I know it's not rational, but I can't shake the feeling that if people knew the truth about why I need these appointments, they'd see me differently. They'd think I was broken or unreliable." Dr. Chun began working on the tension in Sarah's neck and shoulders, areas where stress and old injuries combined to create persistent pain. "Tell me about this fear of being seen as broken," she said gently. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to organize her thoughts. "In the military, you learn that showing weakness can be dangerous. Not just for you, but for everyone around you. People depend on you to be strong, to make good decisions under pressure. When I came back and started having problems with concentration and anxiety attacks, I felt like I was letting everyone down. But you're not in the military anymore," Dr. Chin pointed out. "The rules are different in civilian life. People are allowed to have health issues and seek treatment for them." "I know that intellectually," Sarah said, "but emotionally, it still feels like admitting defeat." Dr. Chin worked in silence for a few minutes, allowing Sarah time to process her thoughts. Finally, she spoke again. "You know, Sarah, there's a difference between hiding your struggles because you're ashamed of them and maintaining privacy because it's your right to do so. You don't owe anyone at work an explanation for your medical appointments." "Then, why do I feel so guilty about it?" Sarah asked. "Because you're carrying the weight of experiences that most people can't understand," Dr. Chin replied. "And because our society still has a lot of misconceptions about mental health and invisible disabilities. But that doesn't mean you need to educate everyone or justify your need for treatment." As the session continued, Sarah found herself thinking about Derek's comments and her reaction to them. She realized that part of what had upset her so much was not just his dismissive attitude, but the grain of truth in his observation. She did use her medical appointments as a way to escape from the office when she was feeling overwhelmed, though not in the way Derek imagined. Sometimes, when the noise and chaos of the workplace became too much to handle, Sarah would schedule an extra therapy appointment or extend her regular sessions. It wasn't about avoiding work or being lazy. It was about recognizing her limits and taking care of herself before she reached a breaking point. But explaining that distinction to someone like Derek felt impossible. "I keep thinking that if I could just be stronger, if I could just push through it, then I wouldn't need all this support," Sarah said as the session neared its end. Dr. Chin paused in her work and looked at Sarah directly. "Sarah, you survived a bomb blast that killed 3 people and left you with a traumatic brain injury. You pulled wounded soldiers to safety while under enemy fire. You came home and built a successful career while managing symptoms that would overwhelm most people. You are one of the strongest people I know. Seeking treatment doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart." The words should have been comforting, but Sarah still felt a lingering sense of inadequacy. She thanked Dr. Chun and made her appointment for Wednesday, then sat in her car for a few minutes before driving back to the office. She dreaded facing Derek again, knowing that his comments would continue to echo in her mind throughout the day. When Sarah returned to the office, she noticed that Derek wasn't at his desk. She felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that she could avoid an awkward confrontation, but disappointment that she hadn't had the courage to stand up for herself earlier. She tried to focus on her work for the rest of the afternoon, but found her concentration suffering as her mind replayed the morning's conversation over and over. As the day wore on, Sarah became increasingly aware of the curious glances from her coworkers. She couldn't tell if she was imagining the attention or if Derek had shared his speculations about her mysterious medical appointments with others. The uncertainty made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of those first months after returning from deployment, when every social interaction felt like navigating a minefield. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, Sarah was exhausted from the effort of maintaining her professional facade while battling her internal turmoil. She gathered her things quickly and headed for the parking garage, hoping to avoid any more encounters with Derek or anyone else who might want to discuss her personal business. But, as she waited for the elevator, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Chen's words about strength and seeking treatment. Maybe it was time to stop seeing her medical needs as something to be ashamed of and start viewing them as part of taking care of herself. Maybe Derek's ignorant comments said more about him than they did about her. The thought was both frightening and liberating. For the first time in months, Sarah began to consider what it might feel like to stop hiding so much of herself from the world around her. The idea terrified her, but it also stirred something that had been dormant for too long, the same courage that had once driven her to risk her life for her fellow soldiers. As Sarah drove home through the evening traffic, she made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would not let Derek's comments pass unchallenged. She wouldn't reveal more than she was comfortable sharing, but she also wouldn't continue to accept his dismissive attitude towards something he clearly didn't understand. What Sarah didn't know was that Derek's casual cruelty was about to set in motion a series of events that would force her to confront not just her own demons, but the assumptions and prejudices of everyone around her. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with truth and the courage to share it. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray, drizzling rain that seemed to match Sarah's mood perfectly. She had spent most of the previous evening rehearsing what she might say to Derek if he decided to continue his commentary about her medical appointments. Part of her hoped he would simply drop the subject and move on to tormenting someone else. But experience had taught her that Derek rarely let go of something that gave him a sense of superiority over his coworkers. Sarah had learned more about Derek Hoffman during her time at Hartwell Financial than she ever wanted to know. He was the type of person who measured his own worth by finding flaws in others, and he had an uncanny ability to identify people's insecurities and exploit them. She had watched him reduce Lisa from human resources to tears with his constant criticism of her presentation style, and she had seen him systematically undermine Tom's confidence during team meetings by questioning every decision Tom made. What made Derek particularly dangerous was his charm. He could be genuinely funny and engaging when he wanted to be, and he had a talent for making his cruelest observations sound like harmless jokes. Management loved him because he consistently exceeded his sales targets, and many of their coworkers found his irreverent sense of humor entertaining. This made it difficult for anyone to call out his behavior without seeming overly sensitive or humorless. Sarah arrived at the office early, hoping to get a head start on her work before the inevitable encounter with Derek. She had a conference call scheduled with a potential new client at 9 o'clock, followed by a meeting with her supervisor to review quarterly projections. Keeping busy would help her maintain focus and avoid dwelling on yesterday's conversation. But Derek had apparently arrived even earlier than Sarah, because he was already at his desk when she walked into the cubicle area. He looked up from his computer as she passed, offering her a smile that seemed genuine enough, but made Sarah immediately suspicious. "Morning, Sarah," Derek said cheerfully. "How was your evening? Do anything exciting, or were you practicing your physical therapy exercises at home?" The comment was delivered with Derek's typical casual tone, but Sarah could hear the underlying mockery. She set her purse down carefully and turned to face him, her expression neutral. "Good morning, Derek," she replied evenly. "I had a quiet evening. How was yours?" "Oh, you know me. Went out for drinks with some clients, closed a decent-sized deal, lived the dream." Derek leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. "Actually, while I was out, I got to talking with Jim Bradley from Meridian Corporation. You know Jim. He's that former Marine who handles their purchasing department." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had a feeling she knew where this conversation was heading, and she didn't like it. Derek continued, seemingly oblivious to Sarah's discomfort. "Anyway, Jim was telling me about how some of these younger veterans come back from overseas and try to milk their service for special treatment in the workplace. You know, claiming PTSD or mysterious injuries to get extra time off, lighter workloads, that sort of thing. Jim says it drives him crazy because it gives real veterans a bad name." The blood rushed to Sarah's face so quickly that she felt dizzy. Derek was staring at her with that same curious expression he had worn yesterday, clearly fishing for a reaction. Around them, other co-workers were beginning to arrive and settle into their morning routines, but Sarah felt as if she and Derek were alone in a bubble of tension. "That's an interesting conversation to have with a client," Sarah managed to say, her voice carefully controlled. "Oh, it wasn't work-related," Derek said with a dismissive wave. "We were just shooting the breeze, you know how it is. But it got me thinking about our conversation yesterday. I mean, I'm sure your PT thing is totally legitimate, but you have to admit it's a little convenient how these appointments always seem to happen during work hours. Sarah could feel her hands beginning to shake slightly, and she clasped them together to hide the tremor. The rational part of her mind was screaming at her to walk away, to report Derek's behavior to human resources, to do anything except engage with him. But the wounded part of her mind, the part that still carried the shame and guilt of surviving when others hadn't, was too hurt and angry to think clearly. Derek, Sarah said quietly, I think you should stop talking now. But Derek had the bit between his teeth now, and he wasn't about to let go. Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk here. I'm just saying that some of us have to work through our aches and pains without special accommodations. I've got a bad back from an old football injury, but you don't see me running off to physical therapy every few days. Your bad back is not the same thing, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. How do you know? Derek challenged. Maybe my back injury is worse than whatever minor problem you're dealing with. But I suck it up and do my job instead of making excuses. The word excuses hit Sarah like a slap across the face. She had heard that word too many times in the months following her return from Afghanistan, from well-meaning friends who thought she was using her military experience to avoid taking on new challenges, from family members who didn't understand why she couldn't just get over her problems and move on with her life. You have no idea what you're talking about, Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. Derek seemed to recognize that he had pushed too far, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his position. Hey, I'm not trying to start a fight here. I'm just pointing out that some people seem to get special treatment around here, and it's not exactly fair to the rest of us who have to pick up the slack. Special treatment? Sarah repeated, her voice growing louder. She was dimly aware that their conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby coworkers, but she no longer cared about maintaining her professional composure. Sarah, maybe we should, Derek began, apparently realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control. No, Sarah interrupted. You wanted to talk about my PT appointments, so let's talk about them. You think I'm getting special treatment because I leave the office 3 times a week for medical appointments. You think I'm making excuses, that I'm somehow weak or dishonest because I need ongoing treatment for injuries you can't see. Derek's face had gone pale, and he was glancing around nervously at their coworkers, who had stopped pretending to work and were openly listening to the confrontation. Sarah, you didn't mean what? Sarah demanded. You didn't mean to accuse me of malingering? You didn't mean to suggest that my medical needs are less legitimate than your football injury? You didn't mean to imply that I'm somehow taking advantage of the system? By now, the entire cubicle area had gone silent except for Sarah's voice. She could see their supervisor, Janet Morrison, approaching from across the room, her expression concerned and slightly alarmed. Sarah knew she should stop, should de-escalate the situation before it got completely out of hand, but months of suppressed frustration and hurt were pouring out of her like water from a burst dam. You want to know about my PT appointments, Derek? Sarah continued, her voice shaking with emotion. You want to know what kind of special treatment I'm getting? My physical therapy sessions are part of my ongoing treatment for traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. I get these injuries when an improvised explosive device blew up my convoy in Afghanistan 3 years ago, killing 3 of my fellow soldiers and leaving me with permanent damage that affects my concentration, my memory, and my ability to handle stress. Derek's mouth had fallen open, and he was staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock and horror. Around them, their co-workers were frozen in place, unsure how to respond to this sudden revelation of Sarah's private pain. The reason I need these appointments during work hours, Sarah continued relentlessly, is because that's when the clinic is open, and because my treatment team includes not just a physical therapist, but also a neurologist and a psychiatrist who specialize in treating veterans with invisible injuries. The reason I don't talk about my medical issues at work is because I was hoping to avoid exactly this kind of ignorant commentary from people who think they understand something they know nothing about. Janet Morrison had reached their area by now, and she was looking back and forth between Sarah and Derek with obvious concern. Is everything okay over here? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Sarah realized that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had revealed more about herself in the past 2 minutes than she had shared with anyone at work during her entire time at the company. The careful walls she had built around her private life had come crashing down, and there was no way to rebuild them now. Everything's fine, Sarah said, though her voice was still shaking. Derek and I were just having a discussion about the legitimacy of medical leave. Derek looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Sarah, I had no idea. I'm really sorry. I never would have said anything if I'd known. Known what? Sarah interrupted. Known that my injuries were real? Known that my service actually meant something? What if I had been making excuses, Derek? What if I was just a malingerer trying to get out of work? Would that have made your comments acceptable? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Derek clearly didn't have an answer. Janet Morrison stepped forward, her expression becoming more authoritative. I think we should all take a step back here, Janet said firmly. Derek, I need to see you in my office immediately. Sarah, would you mind joining us in a few minutes? I think we need to discuss this situation properly. Sarah nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving her feeling drained and exposed. She was acutely aware of the stares from her co-workers, and she wondered how many of them were judging her for her outburst, regardless of what had prompted it. Derek gathered his things and followed Janet toward the management offices, shooting apologetic glances back at Sarah as they walked away. Sarah sank into her chair and put her head in her hands, trying to process what had just happened and what it might mean for her future at the company. Sarah, a voice said softly beside her. Sarah looked up to see Linda Chun, an older woman who worked in the accounting department, standing beside her cubicle with a concerned expression. I just wanted to say thank you, Linda said quietly. My nephew served 2 tours in Iraq, and he's been dealing with some similar issues since he came back. It means a lot to hear someone speak up about what veterans really go through. Before Sarah could respond, Linda had walked away, leaving Sarah to wonder if she had done the right thing or had just made a terrible mistake. She looked around at her co-workers, who were slowly returning to their tasks, though she could see that many of them were still stealing glances in her direction. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Sarah looked down to see a notification from Dr. Chen's office, reminding her of her appointment the following day. The irony was not lost on her. She would need that appointment more than ever now to help her process what had just happened and figure out how to move forward. 20 minutes later, Janet Morrison returned to escort Sarah to her office. Janet was a fair but no-nonsense supervisor in her mid-50s who had been with Hartwell Financial for over a decade. Sarah had always respected Janet's straightforward management style, but she had no idea how Janet would handle this particular situation. Janet's office was small but comfortable, with family photos on the desk and motivational posters on the walls. Janet closed the door behind them and gestured for Sarah to take a seat in one of the chairs facing the desk. First of all, Janet began, settling into her own chair. I want you to know that Derek has been written up for inappropriate workplace behavior, and he'll be attending sensitivity training before he's allowed to interact with his co-workers unsupervised again. Sarah felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by guilt. She didn't want Derek to get into serious trouble, despite how hurt and angry his comments had made her. Janet, I want to apologize for losing my temper, Sarah said. I know I handled that poorly, and I'm sorry for creating a scene in the office. Janet held up a hand to stop her. Sarah, you have nothing to apologize for. Derek's behavior was completely inappropriate, and you had every right to defend yourself. However, I am concerned about you. This situation clearly brought up some difficult emotions, and I want to make sure you have the support you need. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, surprised by the kindness in Janet's voice. She had been bracing herself for disciplinary action or awkward questions about her mental health, not genuine concern for her well-being. I've been managing okay, Sarah said quietly. I have a good treatment team, and I've been working hard to keep my personal issues from affecting my work performance. And you've done an excellent job with that, Janet assured her. Your work has been consistently outstanding since you started here, and you've never given us any reason to question your professionalism or reliability. But I'm realizing now that we may have failed you in some ways. Sarah looked at Janet with confusion. What do you mean? Janet leaned forward in her chair, her expression serious. Sarah, when you were hired, HR flagged that you were a veteran and might be eligible for certain accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But you never requested any accommodations, so we assumed you didn't need any support. Looking back, I wonder if we should have done more to make sure you felt comfortable discussing any needs you might have had. The revelation that the company had known about her veteran status all along was both surprising and somewhat embarrassing to Sarah. She had assumed that her military background was just one line on her resume among many, not something that would be specifically noted by human resources. I didn't want to be treated differently, Sarah admitted. I was afraid that if people knew about my service or my injuries, they would see me as damaged or unreliable. I thought it was better to just blend in and prove that I could do the job as well as anyone else. Janet nodded thoughtfully. I understand that impulse, but I think today's incident shows that trying to hide important parts of yourself can actually create more problems than it solves. Derek's comments were inexcusable regardless, but they might have been avoided if we had better communication about these issues from the beginning. Sarah considered this perspective, wondering if Janet was right. Maybe if she had been more open about her medical needs from the start, she could have avoided the speculation and misunderstandings that had led to today's confrontation. What happens now? Sarah asked, feeling uncertain about her place in the office hierarchy after such a public display of her private struggles. Now we figure out how to move forward in a way that supports everyone, Janet said firmly. I'm going to be having conversations with the entire team about workplace respect and understanding invisible disabilities. Derek will be participating in additional training, and if his behavior doesn't improve significantly, he'll be facing more serious consequences. Janet paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. As for you, I want to make sure you have everything you need to continue doing the excellent work you've been doing. If that includes flexible scheduling for medical appointments, additional accommodations for concentration issues, or anything else that would help you succeed here, I want to know about it. The offer was generous and more than Sarah had dared to hope for, but she still felt hesitant about accepting special treatment. I don't want other people to think I'm getting unfair advantages, she said. Sarah, Janet said gently, accommodation is not the same as advantage. If you need certain supports to perform at your best, providing those supports benefits everyone. It's not about giving you something extra. It's about leveling the playing field so that your talents and skills can shine through. The conversation with Janet lasted another 20 minutes, covering practical details about medical leave policies and potential workplace accommodations. By the time Sarah returned to her cubicle, she felt emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved. The secret she had been carrying for so long was finally out in the open, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, as Sarah settled back into her work, she began to notice small gestures of support from her coworkers. Linda from accounting stopped by to share information about a local support group for veterans' families. Mike from the IT department, who usually kept to himself, mentioned that his brother-in-law was also a veteran dealing with adjustment issues. Even Tom, whom Derek had been bullying for months, offered a quiet word of thanks for standing up to Derek's behavior. Not everyone was supportive, of course. Sarah could see a few co-workers whispering among themselves and casting speculative glances in her direction. She suspected that her revelation would become office gossip for a while, and she would have to deal with awkward questions and unsolicited advice from well-meaning colleagues. But, as the day wore on, Sarah began to realize that the worst part of her ordeal might actually be behind her. For the first time in months, she didn't have to pretend that her medical appointments were minor inconveniences. She didn't have to carefully monitor every word she spoke to avoid revealing too much about her past. She didn't have to carry the weight of her secrets entirely alone. Derek avoided her for the rest of the day, and Sarah was grateful for the space. She wasn't ready to have a reconciliation conversation with him, and she suspected it would be a long time before their working relationship could return to any semblance of normalcy. As 5 o'clock approached, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave the office. She felt as if she had lived through several days' worth of emotional turmoil in the span of 8 hours, and she was looking forward to the quiet sanctuary of her apartment. But, as she walked toward the elevators, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. The carefully constructed persona she had maintained for 18 months had been stripped away, revealing the real person underneath. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, and Sarah had no idea what would happen next. What she did know was that tomorrow would be different. She would return to work as herself, complete with all her scars and struggles and strengths. And, for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, that felt like enough. Wednesday morning brought a different kind of anxiety for Sarah Martinez. She had spent the previous evening alternating between relief and regret about her confrontation with Derek, wondering if she had made a mistake by revealing so much of her personal history to her coworkers. The protective walls she had built around her privacy were gone, and she felt exposed in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of those first vulnerable months after returning from deployment. Sarah arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the morning rush and any awkward encounters with colleagues who might want to discuss what had happened the day before. The parking garage was nearly empty, and the elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual as she prepared herself for whatever the day might bring. The cubicle area was quiet when Sarah settled into her workspace, with only a handful of early arrivals scattered throughout the floor. She focused on checking emails and reviewing her schedule, grateful for the routine tasks that helped keep her anxiety in check. Her physical therapy appointment was scheduled for later that morning, and she wondered if Dr. Chun would notice the change in her emotional state. As the morning progressed and more coworkers arrived, Sarah became acutely aware of the subtle shifts in how people interacted with her. Some colleagues offered warmer greetings than usual, while others seemed uncomfortable and uncertain about how to behave around her now that they knew about her military service and injuries. She could see small clusters of people engaged in hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by, and she suspected that her personal revelation had become a topic of office gossip. Derek's cubicle remained empty until nearly 9 o'clock, and when he finally arrived, he kept his head down and avoided making eye contact with Sarah or anyone else in their immediate area. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and guilt watching him try to make himself invisible. She had never wanted to humiliate him, just to make him understand that his casual cruelty had real consequences. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Wilson, the Human Resources Director, appeared at her cubicle with a gentle smile and a request to chat privately. Margaret was a soft-spoken woman in her early 60s who had a reputation for handling sensitive situations with discretion and compassion. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," Margaret said as they walked toward her office. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's incident and make sure you're doing okay." Margaret's office was decorated with plants and family photos that created a warm, welcoming atmosphere. She gestured for Sarah to take a seat in a comfortable chair near the window, then settled across from her with a file folder and a notepad. "First, I want to acknowledge how difficult yesterday must have been for you," Margaret began. "Having to defend yourself against inappropriate comments about your medical needs should never have been necessary, and I'm sorry that situation arose." Sarah nodded, appreciating Margaret's directness. "Thank you. It wasn't how I had planned to share that information with my coworkers." "I can imagine," Margaret said sympathetically. "Janet filled me in on your conversation yesterday, and I wanted to discuss some options that might help make your work environment more supportive going forward." Margaret opened her file folder and pulled out several documents. "As Janet mentioned, we flagged your veteran status when you were hired, but we never had a formal conversation about potential accommodations. I'd like to change that now, if you're comfortable with it." The word accommodations still made Sarah feel slightly uncomfortable, as if she was asking for special treatment rather than simply trying to manage legitimate medical needs. But her conversation with Janet had helped her begin to reframe these supports as tools that would help her perform her job more effectively rather than crutches that made her weak. "What kind of accommodations are you thinking about?" Sarah asked. Margaret consulted her notes. "Well, based on what you've shared about your treatment needs, we could formalize your schedule flexibility for medical appointments so that you never have to worry about questions or comments from coworkers. We could also look at environmental modifications if noise or lighting affect your concentration. And we could discuss deadline flexibility for particularly complex projects if your cognitive symptoms occasionally interfere with your usual productivity." The offer was more comprehensive than Sarah had expected, and she felt a surge of gratitude toward the company for taking her needs seriously. At the same time, she worried about how these accommodations might affect her relationships with her colleagues. "I don't want other people to think I'm getting special treatment," Sarah said, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her since her conversation with Janet. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "Sarah, I understand that concern, and it's actually quite common among employees who need workplace accommodations. But I want you to consider something. You've been working here for 18 months without any accommodations at all, and your performance has been excellent. You've proven beyond any doubt that you're a valuable employee who contributes significantly to our team." Margaret paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "The accommodations we're discussing aren't about lowering standards or giving you an unfair advantage. They're about removing barriers that might prevent you from performing at your best. If you had diabetes and needed to test your blood sugar during the workday, would that be special treatment? If you wore glasses to correct your vision, would that be an unfair advantage?" The analogy helped Sarah begin to see her situation from a different perspective. Her injuries were real, even if they couldn't be seen, and the treatments she needed were just as legitimate as any other medical intervention. I think I'd like to try some of the accommodations you mentioned, Sarah said slowly. Maybe start with formalizing the schedule flexibility and see how that goes. That sounds like a perfect place to start, Margaret agreed, making notes in her file. I'll work with Janet to document the accommodation and make sure everyone who needs to know is informed appropriately. Margaret set down her pen and looked at Sarah thoughtfully. I also wanted to talk with you about something else. Yesterday's incident with Derek has prompted some conversations among the management team about how we can create a more inclusive environment for all our employees, particularly those who might be dealing with invisible disabilities or other challenges. Sarah felt a flicker of anxiety. What kind of conversations? Nothing that involves you directly, Margaret assured her quickly. But we're realizing that we might not be doing enough to educate our staff about these issues. Many people have never considered what it might be like to live with invisible injuries or ongoing medical needs. And that lack of awareness can lead to the kind of insensitive comments Derek made. Margaret pulled out another document from her file. We're thinking about bringing in a trainer to do a workshop on disability awareness and workplace inclusion. We'd also like to review our policies to make sure they're clear about our expectations regarding respectful treatment of colleagues with medical needs. The idea of a company-wide training session about disability issues made Sarah feel both hopeful and apprehensive. On one hand, education might prevent future incidents like the one with Derek. On the other hand, she worried that such training might inadvertently single her out as the reason for the new policies. Would I be expected to participate in this training? Sarah asked. Only to the extent that you're comfortable, Margaret replied. We would never ask you to share personal details about your medical history or serve as a spokesperson for veterans or people with disabilities unless you specifically wanted to do so. This would be about general education and policy clarification, not personal testimonies. Sarah considered the proposal, weighing her discomfort with public attention against the potential benefits of helping her colleagues better understand these issues. Can I think about it? Of course, Margaret said. Take all the time you need. This isn't something we'd implement immediately anyway. We want to make sure we do it thoughtfully and effectively. They spent another few minutes discussing practical details about Sarah's accommodation request. Then, Margaret walked her back to the main office area. As they emerged from the HR department, Sarah noticed that several coworkers looked up from their work to watch them, clearly curious about what the meeting had been about. Back at her cubicle, Sarah tried to focus on preparing for her conference call with the Jenkins account, but found herself distracted by the awareness of being watched and discussed by her colleagues. She had always prized her privacy and her ability to blend into the background at work, and the sudden attention felt overwhelming. At 11:15, Sarah gathered her things for her physical therapy appointment. For the first time in 18 months, she didn't feel the need to be secretive about where she was going or why. The relief of not having to carefully monitor her words and behavior was significant, even though it came with its own set of challenges. As she passed Derek's cubicle, he looked up from his computer and made brief eye contact with her. His expression was a mixture of shame and uncertainty, and Sarah could see that he wanted to say something but didn't know how to approach her. Derek, Sarah said quietly, stopping beside his desk. Sarah, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm really sorry about yesterday. I had no idea about your service or your injuries, and I should never have made those comments regardless. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. Derek looked genuinely remorseful, but she wasn't sure if his regret stemmed from understanding the impact of his words or simply from getting caught and disciplined. The problem isn't that you didn't know about my specific situation, Sarah said carefully. The problem is that you made assumptions about my medical needs without having any facts to support those assumptions. You decided that my treatments weren't legitimate based on nothing more than your own biases. Derek winced but didn't try to defend himself. You're right. I was completely out of line, and I'm sorry. I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I said, but I want you to know that I realize how wrong I was. Sarah appreciated the apology, even though she suspected it would take time before she could fully trust Derek's change of heart. I accept your apology, she said finally. But, Derek, this can't happen again. Not just with me, but with anyone. You can't comment on people's medical situations or make assumptions about their personal lives. I understand, Derek said quickly. I've been signed up for some training sessions, and I'm going to do better. I promise. Sarah nodded and continued toward the elevators, feeling emotionally drained by the encounter, but also cautiously hopeful that Derek might actually learn from the experience. She had seen people make genuine changes after being forced to confront their own prejudices, though she had also seen plenty of examples of superficial compliance that masked unchanged attitudes. The drive to her physical therapy appointment gave Sarah time to process the morning's events and prepare for her session with Dr. Chun. She found herself looking forward to the appointment more than usual, knowing that she would be able to discuss yesterday's confrontation and its aftermath with someone who understood the complexities of navigating civilian workplaces as a veteran with invisible injuries. Dr. Chun greeted Sarah with her usual warm smile, but Sarah could see the concern in her eyes as they settled into the treatment room. "You look like you've had quite a week, Dr. Chun observed, beginning her assessment of Sarah's physical condition. "How are you feeling?" Sarah found herself recounting the entire story of her confrontation with Derek, her conversation with management, and the mixed reactions from her co-workers. Dr. Chun listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "It sounds like you handled a very difficult situation with courage and grace," Dr. Chun said when Sarah finished her account. "I know it wasn't how you wanted to share that information, but maybe it was time for that secret to come out into the light. I keep going back and forth about whether I did the right thing," Sarah admitted. "Part of me feels relieved that I don't have to hide anymore, but part of me wishes I had just walked away from Derek's comments." Dr. Chun began working on the tension in Sarah's neck and shoulders, areas that always tightened when Sarah was under stress. "Tell me more about the part of you that wishes you had walked away," she said. "I guess I'm worried that people will see me differently now," Sarah said. "For 18 months, I've been just another account manager who happens to have some medical appointments. Now I'm the veteran with PTSD and brain injury who had a meltdown in the office. Is that how you see yourself?" Dr. Chun asked gently. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, when the symptoms are bad, or when I'm struggling with concentration or anxiety, it feels like those things define me more than my skills or accomplishments. But what about the other times?" Dr. Chun pressed. "What about when you're closing big deals or solving complex problems for your clients? Do your injuries define you then?" "No," Sarah admitted. "When I'm working well, I forget about the limitations. I just feel like myself again." Dr. Chun paused in her work and looked at Sarah directly. "Sarah, you are still yourself. Your injuries are part of your story, but they're not the whole story. Yesterday, you stood up for yourself and possibly prevented other people from being treated the way Derek was treating you. That took strength and courage, not weakness." "It didn't feel strong at the time," Sarah said. "It felt like losing control." "Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is show our vulnerability," Dr. Chun replied. "You've been carrying this burden alone for a long time. Maybe it's time to let other people help share the load." The conversation continued as Dr. Chun worked on Sarah's physical symptoms, addressing the headaches and muscle tension that had intensified over the past few days. By the end of the session, Sarah felt more grounded and optimistic about her situation. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said as they wrapped up the appointment. "My HR director mentioned that the company might do some training on disability awareness. Part of me thinks I should get involved to help make sure they do it right." Dr. Chun smiled. "That sounds like an excellent way to turn a difficult experience into something positive. What's holding you back?" "I'm not sure I'm ready to be the poster child for veteran issues or invisible disabilities," Sarah said honestly. "I've spent so much energy trying to blend in and be normal. The idea of standing up in front of my colleagues and talking about my struggles feels terrifying." "You don't have to be anyone's poster child," Dr. Chun assured her. "But you do have valuable perspective and experience that could help other people understand these issues better. Maybe you could start small, just consulting on the training content rather than presenting it yourself." The suggestion appealed to Sarah, offering a way to contribute without putting herself too far outside her comfort zone. She made her next appointment and headed back to the office, feeling more settled about the direction her life was taking. When Sarah returned to work, she found an unexpected surprise waiting at her cubicle. A small bouquet of flowers sat on her desk, accompanied by a card that simply read, "Thank you for your service and your courage. Your colleagues." Looking around the office, Sarah saw Linda from accounting give her a small wave and a smile. Mike from IT nodded in her direction when their eyes met. Even Tom, who was usually too shy to make eye contact with anyone, offered her a thumbs up when he saw her looking. For the first time since her confrontation with Derek, Sarah felt a sense of belonging at work that went beyond her professional competence. She was no longer just the mysterious account manager who kept to herself. She was Sarah Martinez, a valued colleague who happened to be a veteran dealing with invisible injuries, and that was apparently okay with most of the people she worked with every day. The afternoon brought its own challenges, including a difficult client call and a computer glitch that lost an hour's worth of work on an important presentation. But Sarah found that she was handling these normal workplace stressors better than she had in weeks. Something about not having to hide her medical needs had reduced her overall anxiety level, making it easier to cope with everyday frustrations. As the day drew to a close, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 48 hours. The secret she had guarded so carefully was out in the open, and while that brought new challenges, it also brought unexpected opportunities for connection and support. Derek avoided her for the rest of the day, but Sarah noticed that he seemed to be making an effort to interact more respectfully with other colleagues. Whether this change would last remained to be seen, but it was a start. As Sarah packed up her things to leave, she realized that tomorrow would bring new questions and new adjustments. But for the first time in months, she was looking forward to coming to work rather than dreading it. The mask she had worn for so long was gone, and while that felt vulnerable, it also felt like a kind of freedom she hadn't experienced since before her deployment to Afghanistan. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's confrontation with Derek, and the office dynamics at Hartwell Financial Services had settled into a new normal that was both comfortable and strange for Sarah to navigate. The initial awkwardness and whispered conversations had largely subsided, replaced by a more genuine understanding among her colleagues about the realities of invisible disabilities and the challenges faced by many veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Derek had completed his mandatory sensitivity training and had made what appeared to be sincere efforts to modify his behavior toward all his coworkers, not just Sarah. He still possessed the same competitive drive and sometimes abrasive personality, but he had learned to channel these traits in ways that didn't involve attacking his colleagues' perceived weaknesses. Their interactions remained somewhat stilted, but they had achieved a level of professional courtesy that allowed them to work together effectively when necessary. The most surprising development for Sarah had been the number of coworkers who had approached her privately to share their own experiences with medical challenges, family members with disabilities, or struggles with mental health issues. She had discovered that Linda from accounting was caring for a husband with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, that Mike from IT was managing bipolar disorder, and that Tom's apparent shyness was actually related to severe social anxiety that he was addressing through therapy. These revelations had helped Sarah realize that she had never been as alone as she had felt. Many of her colleagues were fighting their own invisible battles, and her willingness to speak openly about her experiences had created space for others to share their struggles as well. The office culture was slowly shifting from one that valued the appearance of perfection to one that recognized the strength required to seek help and support when needed. On this particular Thursday morning, Sarah was preparing for a meeting that she had both anticipated and dreaded for the past 2 weeks. Margaret from Human Resources had scheduled a consultation session where Sarah would review the disability awareness training materials that the company planned to implement for all employees. Sarah had agreed to provide feedback from the perspective of someone living with invisible disabilities, though she was still nervous about taking on any kind of spokesperson role. The training materials were spread across the conference table when Sarah arrived for the 10 o'clock meeting. Margaret was there, along with Janet Morrison and a woman Sarah didn't recognize who was introduced as Dr. Rebecca Torres, an organizational psychologist who specialized in workplace inclusion initiatives. "Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to help us with this," Margaret began as they settled around the table. "Dr. Torres has developed what we think is an excellent training program, but we wanted to get your perspective before we finalize the content." Dr. Torres was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She had a warm but professional demeanor that immediately put Sarah at ease. "I want to start by saying that we're not asking you to represent all veterans or all people with disabilities," Dr. Torres said directly. "Your experiences are your own, and they may be quite different from what other people in similar situations have faced. What we're hoping for is your honest reaction to these materials and any suggestions you might have for making them more effective." The training program was comprehensive, covering everything from basic terminology about disabilities to practical guidance on how to interact respectfully with colleagues who might have accommodation needs. Sarah was impressed by the depth of the research and the sensitivity with which the materials addressed complex issues. "One thing I particularly appreciate," Sarah said, reviewing a section about invisible disabilities, "is that you don't try to minimize the reality of these conditions or suggest that positive thinking alone can overcome them. I've encountered a lot of well-meaning people who think that encouraging someone to stay positive is helpful when it can actually feel dismissive. Dr. Torres nodded thoughtfully. That's something we hear frequently from people with chronic illnesses or invisible disabilities. The intention is usually good, but the impact can be quite harmful. Did you encounter that kind of response when you first returned from deployment? Sarah found herself sharing more than she had intended about her early struggles with reintegration, the well-meaning friends and family members who had suggested that she just needed to get back out there or focus on the positive, and the isolation she had felt when her invisible symptoms made it difficult to explain why certain situations were overwhelming for her. What would have been more helpful? Janet asked, genuinely curious. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think what I needed most was for people to believe me when I said I was struggling, even when they couldn't see obvious signs of injury. And I needed practical support, not just emotional encouragement. Things like understanding when I needed to leave social situations early, or accepting that I might need to reschedule plans if I was having a bad day. Dr. Torres made notes as Sarah spoke, occasionally asking follow-up questions that helped clarify her points. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics ranging from the importance of person-first language to the difference between sympathy and empathy in workplace interactions. There's one other thing I'd like to discuss, Dr. Torres said as the meeting neared its end. We've been considering whether to include a brief segment where employees with disabilities share their experiences directly. Not testimonials exactly, but maybe short video interviews where people talk about what accommodation and inclusion look like from their perspective. Sarah felt her stomach tighten at the suggestion. Would that be voluntary? Absolutely, Dr. Torres assured her quickly. We would never pressure anyone to participate, and we'd make sure that people who did choose to share their stories had complete control over what information they included. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Sarah, we know this is asking a lot, but we wondered if you might consider participating. You don't have to decide today, but your perspective could be really valuable for your colleagues to hear. The idea of appearing in a training video that would be shown to every employee at the company made Sarah's palms sweat. She had come so far in terms of being open about her medical needs, but the thought of having her personal story preserved on video for repeated viewing felt overwhelming. Can I think about it? Sarah asked, echoing the same request she had made weeks earlier when the training was first proposed. Of course, Dr. Torres said kindly. And remember, there are different ways to participate if you decide you want to be involved. You could do an anonymous audio interview, or a written statement that someone else reads, or even just consult on questions that other participants might be asked. The meeting concluded with Sarah promising to review the final training materials once Dr. Torres had incorporated the feedback from their discussion. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Janet pulled Sarah aside for a private word. I wanted you to know that this training initiative has sparked some really positive conversations among the management team, Janet said quietly. We're realizing that we need to do better across the board in terms of creating an inclusive environment, not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone who might feel like they have to hide important parts of themselves at work. Sarah felt a surge of pride at the knowledge that her difficult experience with Derek had contributed to meaningful change in the company culture. It didn't erase the pain of that confrontation, but it gave it purpose and meaning that extended beyond her personal situation. Returning to her cubicle, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Torres's invitation to participate in the training video. The rational part of her mind recognized that sharing her story could help other veterans or people with invisible disabilities feel less alone in their workplace struggles. But the protective part of her mind, the part that had spent 18 months carefully guarding her privacy, recoiled from the idea of such public exposure. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Maria, who lived across the country and had been one of Sarah's strongest sources of support during her recovery. Maria had been pushing Sarah to consider speaking publicly about her experiences, arguing that her story could inspire other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. How did the meeting go? The text read. Are you going to be a movie star? Sarah smiled despite her anxiety and texted back a brief update about the training materials and the video invitation. Within minutes, her phone was ringing with Maria's number on the screen. Sarah, this is amazing, Maria said without preamble when Sarah answered. You have to do the video. Think about how many people you could help. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of exposure, Sarah replied, keeping her voice low so her nearby coworkers couldn't overhear. It's one thing to be open with my immediate colleagues about my medical needs. It's another thing entirely to have my personal story used as a training tool. But that's exactly why it would be so powerful, Maria insisted. You're not some spokesperson who's been trained to give perfect answers. You're a real person with a real story about overcoming real challenges. People need to hear that. Sarah found herself wavering between her sister's enthusiasm and her own instinctive desire to protect her privacy. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make veterans look weak or damaged? Sarah, Maria said gently, you are one of the strongest people I know. You survived a bomb blast. You pulled wounded soldiers to safety. You came home and built a successful career while managing symptoms that would defeat most people. If that's what weakness looks like, then we need more weak people in the world. The conversation with Maria continued for another 20 minutes, covering Sarah's fears about public speaking, her concerns about representing other veterans, and her uncertainty about whether sharing her story would actually help anyone. By the time they hung up, Sarah hadn't made a decision, but she felt more clarity about what was really at stake. The afternoon brought a welcome distraction in the form of a complex project for a new client who was considering a major overhaul of their employee benefits package. The work required the kind of detailed analysis and strategic thinking that Sarah excelled at, and she found herself completely absorbed in the challenges of designing a proposal that would meet the client's diverse needs. Around 3 o'clock, Derek approached her cubicle with an expression that suggested he was gathering courage for a difficult conversation. Sarah looked up from her computer screen, curious about what he wanted to discuss. Sarah, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, Derek said hesitantly. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. Sure, Sarah replied, saving her work and turning to face him. Their interactions had been civil but minimal since his apology 3 weeks earlier, and she was surprised that he was initiating a conversation beyond the basic professional necessities. Derek glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard, then pulled up a chair from an empty cubicle and sat down beside Sarah's desk. I heard through the grapevine that the company is putting together some kind of training about disabilities and inclusion. I was wondering if that had anything to do with what happened between us. Sarah considered how much to reveal about the training initiative. The company has been reviewing their policies and procedures to make sure they're creating an inclusive environment for all employees, she said carefully. I think your comments about my medical appointments were part of what prompted them to look at these issues more closely. Derek nodded, looking uncomfortable but determined to continue the conversation. I wanted you to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you said that day, about how I made assumptions without having any facts to support them. I appreciate that, Sarah said, unsure where the conversation was heading. The thing is, Derek continued, I realize now that I wasn't just wrong about your specific situation. I've been making similar assumptions about other people for years, and I never really thought about how that might affect them. Derek paused, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say next. My younger brother has autism, and he's always had to deal with people making judgments about him based on things they don't understand. I should have known better, but somehow I never connected his experiences to how I was treating my coworkers. The revelation about Derek's brother surprised Sarah and helped her understand some of the shame she had seen in his face after their confrontation. It also explained why his apology had seemed more genuine than she had initially expected. That must have been a painful realization, Sarah said gently. It was, Derek admitted. I called him after our fight to tell him what had happened, and he was pretty blunt about what he thought of my behavior. He pointed out that I've spent years defending him against people who make assumptions about his capabilities, but then I turned around and did the same thing to my coworkers. Derek looked directly at Sarah for the first time since sitting down. I know I can't undo the things I said, and I know it's going to take time for people to trust that I've really changed. But I wanted you to know that what happened between us made me take a hard look at myself, and I didn't like what I saw. Change is possible, Sarah said quietly, but it has to be sustained over time, not just in response to getting in trouble. I understand that, Derek replied. I'm hoping that when the company does this training, I can be part of the conversation about how to do better. Not as an expert, obviously, but as someone who learned some hard lessons about the impact of casual prejudice. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another colleague with a question about a shared project, and Derek returned to his own cubicle. But the exchange left Sarah thinking about the ripple effects of difficult conversations and the possibility that even the most challenging interpersonal conflicts could lead to growth and understanding. As the workday drew to a close, Sarah found herself returning to the question of whether to participate in the training video. Derek's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and commit to change had reminded her that people were capable of learning and growing when given the opportunity, and the right information. Maybe her story could be part of that educational process. Maybe her willingness to be vulnerable could help other people develop empathy and understanding for experiences they had never considered. Maybe the fear and discomfort she felt about public exposure was less important than the potential benefits for other veterans, other people with invisible disabilities, other employees who were struggling to find their place in workplaces that didn't always understand their needs. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Chun to discuss her conflicted feelings about the video invitation. As always, Dr. Chun listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions that helped Sarah explore her own motivations and concerns. What would you need to feel safe and supported if you decided to participate? Dr. Chun asked. The question helped Sarah realize that her fear wasn't really about sharing her story, but about sharing it in a way that felt exploitative or sensationalized. She would need control over the content and presentation, the ability to review and approve the final product, and assurance that her participation was truly voluntary rather than subtly expected. I think I might be ready to do this, Sarah said, surprising herself with the words. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because maybe it's time to turn my worst experience into something that could help other people. Dr. Chin's approval was evident in her voice. Sarah, I've watched you grow so much over the past year and a half. Your willingness to be vulnerable in service of helping others is exactly the kind of strength that makes you such an exceptional person. By the time Sarah ended the call, she had made her decision. She would contact Margaret the next morning to express her willingness to participate in the training video, with the understanding that she would have input into how her story was presented and used. It was a big step, bigger than the confrontation with Derek or the conversation with management about accommodations. This would be a deliberate choice to use her platform and her experience to educate others and advocate for understanding. It felt terrifying and empowering in equal measure. And for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. 6 months had passed since the day Derek Hoffman made his thoughtless comment about Sarah Martinez's PT excuse, and the transformation in both their lives had been more profound than either of them could have imagined. The training video that Sarah had ultimately decided to participate in had become a cornerstone of Hartwell Financial Services' employee development program, and its impact had rippled far beyond the walls of their downtown office building. Sarah sat in the same conference room where she had first reviewed the disability awareness training materials, but this time she was there for a very different purpose. Representatives from 3 other companies in the city had requested meetings to learn about Hartwell's inclusion initiatives, and Sarah had agreed to share her perspective on how organizations could create more supportive environments for employees with invisible disabilities. The irony was not lost on her that she had gone from someone who desperately wanted to hide her medical needs to someone who was regularly invited to speak about them in professional settings. The transformation had been gradual but steady, built on small steps and growing confidence rather than sudden revelation. The training video itself had been easier to create than Sarah had anticipated. Dr. Torres had worked with her to develop a script that felt authentic rather than rehearsed, focusing on practical information about workplace accommodations rather than dramatic personal details. Sarah had been able to discuss her experiences as a veteran with invisible injuries without revealing the specific circumstances of her deployment or the traumatic details of the IED attack that had changed her life. The video had been well received by Sarah's colleagues, many of whom had approached her afterward to express appreciation for her willingness to share her story. More importantly, it had sparked meaningful conversations throughout the company about how to create a more inclusive environment for all employees, regardless of their individual circumstances or challenges. Derek had also participated in the training program, though in a different capacity. He had worked with Dr. Torres to develop a segment about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias, drawing on his own experience of learning to examine his assumptions about other people. His participation had been voluntary, and Sarah had been impressed by his willingness to use his mistakes as a teaching tool for others. Their working relationship had evolved into something approaching genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and hard-earned understanding. Derek still possessed his competitive nature and occasionally abrasive personality, but he had learned to channel these traits in ways that motivated rather than undermined his colleagues. More importantly, he had become an advocate for inclusion initiatives within the company, using his influence and networking skills to promote awareness and understanding. Sarah, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to meet with us, said Jennifer Walsh, the Human Resources Director for Metropolitan Insurance Group. We've heard wonderful things about Hartwell's training program, and we're hoping to implement something similar at our company. Around the table sat representatives from 3 different organizations, all of whom were grappling with how to create more inclusive workplaces for employees with diverse needs and backgrounds. Sarah had been nervous about the meeting initially, but she had discovered over the past few months that